So by way of very short intro, Sedale, you are, many time founder, have worked in the sort of the federal grant space, now spending a lot of time in AI, generally lovely person, and offered to do this talk about just government, right? And so I think we're going to go in, whatever directions make sense, but I'm just going to cede my time to you so you can take us where you want to take us. And also people, this is a discussion, so bring up questions, comments, probably just go off mute at different points, but Sedale, take it away.
Awesome, beautiful. Yeah, it's great to be here with y'all. And because we have a nice intimate room today, feel free to just kind of raise your hands and would love to I don't want to do full introductions because that can take a minute, but if you want to come off mute and just say kind of what you're up to at the moment, like are you looking to work with the government? Are you working in government right now? Maybe we can do that real quick. And I'll just kind of to speed the process along. I'll just say the person to my left, which is on my screen, David, if you want to and then if you also just want to opt out, just stay on mute and keep your camera off, and you don't have to talk if you don't want to, of course.
Sure. So I'm doing a little bit of work with some national labs, well, getting their support in operationalizing some of their the tools that they developed, in particular NREL.
Awesome.
But I've done a little bit of work also with NCAR before, and would love to A, do a little bit more work with these guys, and B, always looking for grants. So
Cool. I'm just going to go around the circle here. Tim, you're next in my.
Yeah, I'm just curious. Some companies I'm invested in seeking out contracts and for the future, sort of advice and thoughts that I can, sort of pass through to them when they're looking for what to do, and how to approach it.
Sweet. Amanda?
Hi, I'm sorry I was a little bit late. I just joined in. Are we doing introductions?
We're just doing real quick what you're interested in
Excellent.
figuring out.
Sure. I'm Amanda Sardonis. I'm the Director of Policy and Partnerships at the Gund Institute at the University of Vermont. And I am excited about this session because one of the things in my job description is developing relationships with our congressional representatives.
Awesome. Beautiful. Nevin?
Hey, Evan. I'm located in New York. I work for the government. I work for the city government here in New York. So I have that perspective, but I'm also um, sort of, in the startup ecosystem a little bit, and one company I'm talking to is interested in government grants, and so just trying to get some um, more information. Thanks.
Awesome. I see familiar face, Devin. If you want to pop on real quick.
Hi,
What's up?
nice to see you.
I'm just going to go ahead and folks who are just for the purpose of continuing on this conversation, it seems like we have a good mix of curious folks who are interested in government, and folks who might be in the government but are also trying to support folks integrating and interfacing with government. So appreciate y'all voicing your thoughts, and happy to hear more specific questions and other things if you want to come off mute. But I did want to just do a little table setting here, um, and then dive into a discussion. So I think the big thing that we have a lot of different folks that we've been talking with over the last few weeks. There's a lot of obviously interesting and somewhat concerning, and then other times not so concerning activities that are going on, especially at the federal level. And I wanted to just relay a couple thoughts, but one of the big ones is that we are seeing, in particular for domestic programs, We're not seeing them stop necessarily, but what we are seeing is some rearticulation of some of their goals and objectives. And as that happens, you just want, I mean, in one sense, it's very much business as usual, which is to say that like, hey, here's a set of hoops you have to jump through and criteria we want you to hit, and you need to hit that. We had a program just recently that we helped a bunch of folks apply for that was stopped, frozen, and then it was re-released a week later, and the deadline was moved by a week, and everyone could still apply, and there was just some like rearticulation of, hey, these are the goals and objectives of this program. And I think what we'll see by and large is a lot of that, in particular in the kind of like energy and climate space, because there's so much of this space that is related to economic development and overall kind of domestic policy. Unfortunately, things like USAID were a lot easier of a target to like take down because it's foreign and no one is getting reelected on the basis of what your embassy is up to and wherever. And so anyways, that's, you know, there's a lot of things that are changing. There's a lot of it that's still the same, which is like, hey, government grant money is sort of annoying to apply for. There's a lot of paperwork and you have to read some complicated documents and then do the things that the government asked, and then you can get funded. And so in all of this, what becomes even more important than it was before is having really good relationships with those people. And it's still very much a relationship driven space. And I'd say even more so now, where having the capability of like getting on a call and talking with a contracting officer, getting on a call and talking with your, you know, if you have existing grants, and this is something we've been telling everyone, it's like, hey, call your contracting person and like figure out what's going on, because they may or may not know, but they can at least give you the inside scoop from within their org about what to expect and what's happening. And I realize there's a lot of things in flux and there's a lot of funding that seems like it's up for grabs, but by and large, the sort of like programs that we see a lot of people applying to, like SBIR, they're just out there and they're still moving along, and you still need to apply by the deadlines. And so just be aware that like, yeah, some of these programs might be stopped and paused momentarily, but you're still going to need to apply by the deadline. You're still going to need to do the things you're doing. And until you hear otherwise, if you intend to get that money, then you need to do that. So yeah, just wanted to like throw that out there and say that additionally, we have, you know, there's some great people in the ecosystem. There's great people that we're tracking who kind of are keeping tabs on all that. And frankly, if that's not your full-time job and your full-time job is building a business, then, you know, build your business. At the end of the day, all of the solutions and the system that we operate under, which is capitalism, requires that you figure out how to thrive in the market and how to win if that's what you're doing is building a business. On the technology side, you know, we're still seeing lots of appetite and a lot of interesting opportunities. So anyways, just wanted to like kind of set that stage. The TLDR perhaps to take away is that there's a lot of stuff in flux and there's a lot of stuff that's still the same. And, you know, I would proceed with about the same confidence as you did before for most programs when it comes to federal funding that's domestically destined. So just wanted to say that. I would love to hear any specific questions. I see there's some in the chat. But if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to dive into those. I'm also happy to talk a little bit about what, you know, our current playbook looks like and how we're thinking about funding at large and the government as a partner. But yeah, I'm always happy to take questions. I see one question that just says how we can work with government departments on projects. And I think that that's a great question to start with. And I will say, like, yeah, we always think about the government, and when we look at it, it looks kind of monolithic and moving in one direction. But there's a ton of, you know, obviously nuance and differentiation throughout state and federal government. And there's a ton of opportunity. And the best place to start is if you know where you want to be within the ecosystem. So say you work in climate and you want to work with the Department of Energy, rolling in and saying, hey, what can we do to help? That's a great first step. There's usually a laundry list of things that they need. And oftentimes that's how we've gotten some of our biggest contracts, is just wandering in and saying, hey, what do you need? Like, what can we do for you? And they'll list it right off because they are trying to get a lot done with not very much. And, same as always, they have more money than people. And they also have more money than talent, generally speaking, which is not to cast dispersions, but just to say that they have capital and not a lot of people who actually build stuff. And so that's the best place to start. A question?
Well, yes. So my question is like rolling in, what does that mean, right? Let's say there's not a lot of people, they're overworked in the federal government, especially. I want to be like, hey, how can I be helpful? Or is what I'm doing helpful to you? Create some sort of connection or relationship. How does one do that? Maybe as like the first, I have no connections to government. What's my first step?
Yeah. If you have zero connections, maybe your first step can be reaching out to even your local government people. You could email them or literally show up and ask to meet with somebody. That can work. It can be effective. It can also not work. I would start with like government. You can think about them a lot like venture capital, which is warm introductions really do help. And so if you have zero, if you're starting from nowhere, even asking like other people in your network about their connection and connectivity to government can be really effective. The other place that is surprisingly accessible many times is just your elected officials. You can email them and reach out and say, hey, I'm a business in your district and I'm interested in working with the government. That can usually light a fire. Like they are always interested in engineering those successes. And so they want to see that kind of nexus happen. The other thing that can be super effective along those same lines is there are organizations across the United States that are funded to help you win government contracts. And they've evolved over the years. It was called the PTAX. Now it's called something else. I forget. I'll look it up. But these are orgs that are funded by the Defense Logistics Agency, amongst others, to help you secure and build business relationships with the government. And so that can be a really great now they're called the Apex Accelerators. That's what they're called. The National Apex Accelerators. So those are resources that exist that will help you access and build relationships with the federal government. But again, those are very the Apex Accelerators very much is about that kind of like business relationship. But if you are looking to do more research or get involved in policy or some other thing, it can often make sense just to reach out to your representatives, your elected representatives in your area. That can be a great jumping off point if you have no other access.
Okay, and then my follow-up, as someone who really doesn't have a lot of context here in terms of how to engage in like a business way, is you can get a contract with government and that's great. My understanding is it takes a really long time and there's like a long sales cycle. Could also apply for grants, right? Which is like this different sort of avenue, also takes time, has a different sort of like cycle to it. Maybe there's a third route of engaging with government. It's like policy and things like that. But we're just talking about these first two routes. How does engaging with people change, right? Like, is it the same sort of relationship building if I'm looking to get a contract or, procurement agreement with government versus if I'm applying for a grant?
Yeah, overall, I'd say yes. It's pretty similar, and in fact, grants are often used as a workaround to shortcut the contracting process. And so yeah, at the end of the day, the lever you're pulling frequently for these individuals is, hey, I solve a problem that you have, and you have money, but you don't have a way to solve the problem. So this is a great marriage, so to speak, right? And that's what's so cool about, often like the grant process in particular. And one of the reasons it exists the way it does. So like thinking about, the one that is, really well known is the DoD SBIR program, which as a contract vehicle is really incredible for a bunch of different reasons. But one of the reasons it's uniquely effective and interesting is because your phase one is all about customer discovery. So once you've made that connection, instead of like having to figure out how to execute on a $60 million DoD contract, you get 100K or sometimes 50K, and you spend 6 months talking to the people who would ultimately use your product, and working with them, right, and building a solution. And the phased approach to SBIR in general follows this pattern of like early problem solving and ideation in order to solve a problem. And there are, in many programs, it's like direct to phase two kinds of options for ideas that are maybe better developed. But again, when you're just thinking about like putting yourself in the role of someone who is working for the government, and you're like just trying to think through like, how do I leverage sort of an empathetic understanding of this individual? The basic mechanics of it are that it's like they have a problem that they want to solve, and they have resources to solve it, but they don't, like, they have money, they don't have a solution that works. And hopefully that's what you're bringing to the table, whether that be policy or technology innovation. And so, yeah, from the sort of like, what does it look like, is stripping away all the other stuff. It looks like it's a very human sort of experience, right? It's like, oh, I have a problem, I can solve that. Would you like to, exchange, goods? And, here you go. So that part's really cool. And I do think, people overcomplicate the rest of it's just details. But at the end of the day, like that's what you're doing. And I think where people go wrong frequently is they misunderstand the problem that government person might have. And that's where there's like missteps. But yeah, if you understand the problem and you're solving it, then you're in great shape.
Can I ask a question on that? Just to follow up, like the SBIR stuff, I actually wrote a letter of intent, and then we got a non-solicitation yesterday. And I think part of it was just like we were doing our best to understand the problem, but like to actually maybe, have, I think, done better in reflection. I would have had to think a fair amount of hours to just understand the problem even more. And I wasn't even sure if it was the right hours spent on what, because it's like 4 paragraphs and you're kind of like, all right, like, so do you have any recommendations on like how to expedite that? Or like, a lot of this is about being able to focus on the right things. And so, yeah.
Yes. The big recommendation, frankly, I would say is you probably want to hire a consultant to help you like go deeper on that, unless you have time. But I will say that there's frequently a difference between what's being stated and what the like real sort of intent of a particular program is. And unfortunately, like there's a bunch of different reasons for that, right? Like sometimes there's intentional vagueness because they are afraid of buttonholing themselves into a specific solution. So there's sort of like policy reasons for it. Sometimes there's intentional vagueness because there's a specific vendor that they're trying to procure something from and they didn't say it. But that can be also true, right? Like there's programs that we look at and they come out every year and we're like, oh, this is for a really specific vendor. Like this incumbent has picked up this contract every year or every 5 years or whenever, so there's that happens as well. I will say in the SBIR world, what's more than typical is just that, yeah, you may have like not understood a certain nuance of the program that is well understood by the agency, but they don't have like the ability to be highly prescriptive when they're putting those broad agency announcement and SBIR topics out, because they're afraid of pigeonholing themselves or like not disallowing certain solutions. And so you have, just challenges in bureaucracy that make it difficult to engage. And so sometimes the consultant can really help you unpack that, just because they spend a lot of time. That's what they do. But the other opportunity, of course, is just to, reapply and also work with that agency more. Again, these are not fast processes. This is very much a strategy of kind of skating to the puck and being there. There's a really funny, this is not necessarily a good pop culture reference because it's a bit niche. So I'll just say, like, this is a long-term process. And if you spend a lot of time around the government, you start to understand what these pain points are even more acutely, and you can respond to them. And if you're continue to participate, right? So it's not only about showing up and applying the one time, but it's about participating when they have requests for information and participating when there are RFIs, which, as I mentioned, those are requests for information. So often when they'll start building out programs, they'll reach out to industry to help shape their understanding of the ecosystem at large. And they do this through public meetings and requests for information. And it, as a strategy, it makes a lot of sense to help shape that understanding, right? Because they're at that time defining kind of the universe for themselves using the best tools they have available, which is generally industry. And so, again, this is why it's kind of annoying as a founder or a business person to do it, because that's not your core job. But if you can hire a consultant, or if you happen to have the time, it can be the most effective way, is to help shape from the very beginning what like those programs and funding allocations are going to look like. Because down the road, then once you apply, you really do fit their understanding of what solutions look like.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
I'm gonna pop. Feel free to raise your hands or just come off mute, but I'll also pop the next question down here. Just says, can we work with federal government? Local is more doable depending on where you are, as I understand. And if you want to like clarify your question, you can come off mute here. But working with the federal government is great. Obviously, there's a lot of, as we talked about, lots of things in flux there. But great, like contractually, they pay their bills, generally speaking, and so it can be a really good experience. And obviously, you can get lots of distribution out of that, right? So contracts can turn into much larger contracts, and you can be there for a very long time. There's nothing really earth-shatteringly new about this system. For what it's worth, it's always been relationship driven. Like, this isn't a new thing for this new administration. And it's always been, somewhat based on the priorities of the administration as well, where you'll see more funding allocated to different places. I've been talking about this, as you can imagine, nonstop and in different meetings for the last few weeks. The big takeaway I have is what I said earlier, which is that, there's going to be changes to sort of the direction and maybe like desired outcomes of programs, but a lot of programs are going to be around. And while there might be like sort of pauses to funding from time to time as the sort of language is issued in different ways, we don't see any like major like programs going away. And a lot of that has to do more with just the fact that a lot of these domestic programs drive a lot of domestic economic development. So work with the federal government, work with your state governments, build those relationships. Yes, I will, like, local government is a bit more accessible. And often that's just because you can kind of like walk around and see them if they're in your community. But the federal government's equally great. And I will say that, like, once things have stabilized a bit and there's a more sort of form taken, we've had, great experiences going to DC and meeting with agencies that we want to work with. So it can be well worth your time to go to the capital of wherever you want to work with and sit down with these folks in person, and have meetings, build connections. Again, there's a lot of relationship driven stuff. So making that happen can be huge. Putting in FaceTime, there's a reason, that lobbyists just like sort of hang out in the halls of government, and run people down. And that's like, it's an effective strategy for better or for worse. There's a good question here about learning how to partner with states and or metros to standardize power sector data sharing structure and accessibility. I would love to hear more about this, because it sounds very cool and fun. If you want to unmute, but I think maybe the question here is like, how do we build some kind of like, how do we get states to adopt some sort of standard anything? As someone who spent like 7 years trying to build a common app for government grant funding, that's like a very hard, long road to be engaged in. And there's been some companies that have had an incredible amount of success adopting standard protocols for X, but not a lot. And we have yet to crack the code on specifically how to make some of that happen, although we have some really good ideas. And a lot of it has to do with figuring out like who your kind of like people are going to create that center of gravity to draw people into those standards. So we've done a bunch of work with like the open source community that's been building simplergrants.gov. And so finding like a convening and organizing power within the federal government to help drive some of that standard forward, that'd be huge. So yeah, when you talk about sort of standards and getting adoption across government for different things, you need to find a champion. Again, comes down to like just those relationships. Find that champion who's going to move it forward. And yeah, that's a tough one to crack. But our kind of theory of change has been and had been when we were working on that and continue to work on stuff like that is we found different groups that were also doing that. We figured out that like, oh, this needs to be open source in some sense. And it also needs to have like a large group like HHS and the grants.gov team to drive it forward. And so that's really where we started to like build and work in that ecosystem. And we'll see what happens in the next couple of years. But it's moving forward, and it only took us 7 years to do so. And it's not done yet. So we'll see. We'll see. But it's a great question. Do I have a list of what's left and available? I don't exactly know. For DAC point of view, most of the government grant access via DOE is gone. I don't have a whole list of like what is left and what's available. Again, there's things just change from day to day. I think the best option there is to like be really engaged with whomever is deploying grants if you have current ones. Be in touch with them and just keep appraised of what's happening. I will say that like there's deadlines posted for different opportunities, and as long as you can still apply for them, probably just honor those and apply. But yeah, very much actively like influx all of that information. Who are the people beyond Apex that I follow, and how do you stay updated when the government is asking for public engagement? So we work with a couple of different folks in the space. from a human perspective, I'm a big fan of this guy, Matt Watkins, who has worked in our ecosystem for a long time. You can find him on LinkedIn. He's a public affairs guy who came out of the Ferguson group, and he's just fantastic at keeping tabs on everything. So that's who, like, I mostly just retweet him because I can't keep up with everything. So I just like watch what Matt's doing and then I retweet and repost. That's how I keep tabs on everything. There's some great tools out there as well. If you are in more of like an enterprise, or you're investing in something, Fiscal Note is a fantastic platform. We're big fans of them and their tooling for keeping tabs on all of this stuff. And again, though, find yourself your own Matt Watkins. Obviously, you can go follow him on LinkedIn, but like find yourself someone that you know does a good job and trust and has those relationships. And it's a game changer for sure. For staying updated on public engagement type stuff, I honestly like this one is a little bit easier. Generally speaking, because of the federal rules, you can sign up for an agency listserv and you'll get all the notices when meetings are, and you'll get notices when they publish things for public comment, and you'll get, RFIs and all that fun stuff. So that one's a little bit easier. And that extends, at the state level, and even your local government, generally speaking, although they might not have the most sophisticated system, they'll be publishing stuff like that. And so that public data, that's fairly easy to stay appraised of. It's not always like a fun thing to wade through again, but like it's there. So yeah, I would definitely there's all kinds of great public affairs people and government relations folks. And I will say this, like, if you have zero connections to government and zero network in this space, maybe your first step is dig through your LinkedIn or whatever, find that friend who like went to Deloitte and got into public affairs and just like reconnect or whatever. Just be like, yo, I need your brain. It's just so nice. Like, I don't want to like be on Twitter all day, or X or whatever they call it now. And I don't really want to read the news. So I have Matt, who Candace was nice enough to put his link in the chat here. Find yourself a Matt. Matt is great. You can follow him. I'm sure he wouldn't mind. But get a resource who is navigating this stuff professionally, and that's what they do, and tap into them. Because they're just like, that's just fantastic. Yeah. And yeah, I'm happy to answer other questions. I also, in terms of staying up to date, like there's a bunch of different really great like newsletters you can tap into. There's Google alerts, like there's so much stuff there. It really just depends on how you process information and exactly what you're trying to stay up to date on. But I will say, like, again, I've spent the last week fielding calls from different partners and working with folks who are trying to navigate all of this. And, there's still so much opportunity. There's still money on the table, and there's applications that need to get done and in the door. So I would just, keep pushing forward more or less. David, do you have a question?
Yeah, do you have any recommendations for companies that are not American based, maybe have an American presence? So I left the States a handful of years ago, and that definitely reduces the availability to get, for instance, DOE, DoD grants. But is there anything that's still available from the US side?
Yeah, there's always like the opportunity to subcontract on all kinds of different things. With research, it can be a little bit more complicated. But the other opportunity, of course, is if your company has nexus in one of the US states, you could just apply there, right? So you don't have to necessarily go the federal funding route. And then, depending on where you are, other nations have really robust, research and, funding opportunities, both grants and contracts. So of course you can always look there as well. Particularly the EU and the UK have really robust, funding ecosystems. But I tell people all the time, like my hot take on the space, I suppose, is like getting a grant is the worst. And I would much rather be a subcontractor to somebody who has a big grant, right? Like I will go subcontract to UCLA to build battery technology before I get a grant from the CEC to do battery technology. For like just getting a grant sucks. There's so much reporting and it's annoying and compliance and all that fun stuff. And so obviously it can be a good experience and it can be transformative and so forth. But at the same time, if you have an opportunity, like you've got a great technology or you've got a great team, find collaborators. Like there's like the whole ecosystem of the federal, or I should say the university ecosystem in the United States is like built for grant receiving and managing. Like that's what they do best. Like if you're like, what is the job you do? They're like, we take money and then we manage it and make sure like that it's managed well. And everyone's happier then, right? Like they get to do all the management, you get paid, and you get to do your work, and the government's happy because their money didn't get mismanaged. So that's definitely an option. In that vein, there's also fiscal sponsors and other groups that exist for the express purpose of like taking grant money and managing it properly. And so you can always just subcontract, which is potentially less messy, especially if you're foreign based and outside of the US. And then of course, depending on where you are, Horizons, the EU funding clearinghouse is massive. The UK, find a grant. There's so much funding outside of the US as well.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Concerned about the federal government breaking contracts, seeing funding freezes and stop work orders. Yeah, I think that's a real concern. Like I said, we've seen whole programs go away. We've seen whole agencies go away. I think it'll probably continue happening. And it's definitely a whole thing that's in flux. I will say, again, the thing that we're seeing more often than not is that contracts are getting paused and sort of like outcomes are getting redefined or metrics are getting redefined, and a lot less of sort of like wholesale abandonment of research overall. And again, I think that's a lot to do with just the fact that like domestically, a lot of that is tied to people's congressional districts and businesses in those spaces. And so there's more of a sort of carrot and stick situation there, as opposed to sort of like wholesale, USAID going away. So, yeah, I mean, it's concerning. I think at the same time, there's like very real kind of domestic impacts that, we're seeing more than just like full like abandonment of contracts of just like programs that are being paused and a bit redefined and then reissued. So I think there will be a lot of that. But I don't think there's going to be like a full wholesale abandonment of those particular kind of like streams of funding. If there's, feel free to dump more questions too. How did I get into government work? Well, that's a whole different story. Now, I honestly just sort of fell into it. I was in the midst of doing a variety of projects for a couple companies overseas, and they valued a lot my experience with the US government. So one of my first jobs, I was a legal analyst for companies looking to navigate the US EPA and import engines. And that turned into helping Environment Canada define some of their regulations for small spark ignited engines as well. And one thing led to another, and all of a sudden I was, helping like bigger kind of petroleum companies navigate government in South America and North America. And yes, ultimately, I ended up building a whole consulting business because I realized one thing that I had as a superpower was that I could sit and read through government garbage and help people build relationships in government. And a lot of other people just didn't have the patience for it. And so that's what I ended up doing, is just being a sort of patient obsessed person. Yeah, so here we are now, 15 years later. But yeah, I always, and I still believe this, the government in terms of a partner can be very powerful for a bunch of different reasons. They have a lot of money, and they also have a lot of connections, and they tend to be able to exert influence on industries that are somewhat hard to move. And so, like I said, I started my kind of like some of my first big clients were engine manufacturers, and after that, some of my biggest clients were petroleum exporters. And so worked in these like large regulated industries that are quite hard to make a move. And government can become a very powerful and interesting ally. And I think that's true of, frankly, any administration, because at the end of the day, where you start to see real power is like, I remember laughing, like the largest companies, like I work for some of the largest engine manufacturers in the world who build these like massive engines that power cruise ships. And, like you could stand up inside one of the cylinders in these things. And these guys would have the worst time. And there was just some dude at the EPA who wasn't even like an appointed person. He was just this salaried dude. And because of his stamp, they wouldn't be able to sell these engines in the United States. And that's the power of a bureaucrat. And so, you do like, you spend a lot of time, and I've spent enough time that, like, yeah, the administration changes and whatnot. But at the end of the day, like, it's that bureaucrat at that desk who's signing those permits. That's the guy or gal that you need to like make friends with and understand what their motivations are. Otherwise, you're not gonna, you might be looking down the barrel of like literally millions of dollars in revenue that you can't make, or that you can make on the basis of that person's decision making. And that's government. It's a wild and a really interesting machine. And while yeah, we make a lot of, and they certainly do have influence of sort of elected officials and people who work with them, the end of the day, it's that bureaucrat who's signing things that is the real person that is like moving the cogs of the global economy along. So yeah, it is a very like strange and interesting realization that I had early on in my career, and that's exactly what I've been focused on for the last 15 years. But yeah, happy to like, if any of you have like a specific thing you want to talk about and get into, I'm happy to do it. And yeah, I appreciate all y'all's time today. Happy to answer any other questions as well.
Maybe just a thought on like how the DOE is changing. Like we just, there's obviously a new head of the DOE. They're open to fracking and a bunch of things. They say kind of weird stuff like climate change is real, but it's not happening. It's all very kind of, I think we got feedback on like how to think about, how to work on climate in a Trump administration, but now like it's coming into more focused, like who's actually doing that work in different places. And their sort of set of priorities are kicking in. And so just curious, like, do you have thoughts on any of that? Or are you like the angles, like, maybe the current guy is a fracking guy. So geothermal seems to be something he's more into than like, like, or I was, I spent a solid number of weeks at the beginning of the year looking at interconnection queues, right? Based off of
Right.
actually the grant that you pointed us to. And we went
Mhm.
like all in on that. And I don't know if that's relevant to them anymore, or I mean, to my mind it should be, but maybe they're like, we're just going to slow down projects because mostly this is solar and batteries and things that we're less stoked about. Or I don't know. Any
Totally.
thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts, and it's probably a longer discussion, but the shortest version that I can say is there's kind of two levers, right? One is I think that uh, you know, any solution that you're bringing to market still needs to like kind of function in this capitalist, like in a capitalist market. Which is to say that I think you're not going to find perhaps necessarily an appetite to subsidize something, but if you've brought a solution to market, you're going to find people who want it. Like the solving an interconnect problem is something that like Schneider is also going to be interested in, and Sempra, right? So if you're solving a problem where there's an economic outcome that's like very desirable, you're still solving a problem that's very desirable to be solved, and you'll find people who want to pay for that solution, and it just might not be the current DOE. Um, that's part of my take on it. It's just like, oh, guess what, guys? Yeah, there's probably not as much grant funding available for that. Plus, it's probably going to get a lot more competitive because there's less. And I think you'll see a bunch of like maybe interesting or weird or conservative from like a risk standpoint tax taken. But at the same time, I think you'll see industry is still hungry for this stuff, right? Like the fact that people do or do not believe in climate change, or that the agency does not, doesn't change the fact that people want more resources on the grid and that they want to solve the interconnect problem. And so I've been working on a couple papers on that front, but just I do think there's a forcing function in some of this that is going to drive, in particular, climate entrepreneurship to seek really competitive market focused solutions. And I think finding people who want to fund that is also part of the equation, right? Because some of it just like requires a lot of capital, which is not necessarily the hardest thing to come by. Right? Sometimes it's like the technology and the solution that you've unlocked. So yeah, I think that there's definitely stuff changing. And I think that you'll find that there's people who want to fund it, and maybe you end up looking outside of the DOE and to some extent.
Cool. That makes sense.
Legal constraints and funding outside of the US. Do you want, if you can come off mute,
Yeah.
Evan, did you want to I'm not exactly sure what that question is overall.
Yeah, I'm also trying to understand. I had a conversation with someone from Switzerland, and they're, sitting on a funding accelerator type of organization that I was told that it is illegal to fund a company that is outside of Switzerland, for example, or outside of EU. So, do you have any thoughts on that, or have you heard anything similar? Like, has anyone heard anything like that?
If you're talking about the federal government,
No, not really, like private money.
I mean, you can do whatever you want with your private money. Um,
I mean, yeah, but thinking, yeah, I don't know. This is something that I start looking into, as, from the direct air capture perspective, we have to shift and start looking for funding outside of the US as well. That's an answer. That's something that I got, and I'm trying to understand if that is a common thing. It changes from country to country, organization to organization, but it seems like something that we might be running into.
Yeah, I mean, if it's private money, that'd be weird. But maybe it's a thing. Governments are well known for, generally speaking, because they're funding things out of the tax base. They'll want to fund companies that are either naturalized or are from the country of origin. And there might be I am no expert when it comes to sort of investor rules in other parts of the world. And I'm barely an expert on investor rules here. But that could be something at play. But generally speaking, I haven't found that to be true of like private funds that you can kind of just do whatever.
Is
Yeah.
that true for federal then? Like,
No, not at all. The federal government, generally speaking, funds companies that are 51% US owned or more. And they're generally prohibited from giving money, especially in the form of grants and sometimes in the form of contracts to non-US based companies. And that's again, that's not a new thing. That's just like the fact of the matter, since it's the US tax base that's generating those funds in the first place.
well, I'll dig into it and I'll share my findings with you all.
Yeah, definitely let us know.
I can keep asking you questions for days, Sedale. So I don't know. I don't want to hog the space, but if no one's going, I'm gonna keep going.
No, yeah, do it. Let's do it. What you got? We got 5 more minutes. So
No, just curious, like you're in the conversations I've had with you, your center of gravity seems to be more at the federal level in DC. But I was curious if there were state organizations that you felt had it, more together or were good to work with, or, like is there stuff in New York or in Massachusetts or in California or Texas?
yeah, New York, NYSERDA is a really great energy focused agency, deploys lots of funding into the space. In California, the California Energy Commission and the California Air Resources Board have robust and quite significant amounts of funding for everything from R&D to sort of deployment and demonstration of technologies in the space. So those are just 2 examples. I think those are probably the most active state agencies in the United States that are funding climate related, like energy related stuff. And so, yeah, I will say, for what it's worth, the Energy Commission is where I've spent the most amount of my time, and NYSERDA is second, in terms of like state-based agencies that are funding energy activities. And both of them really great to work with, incredibly well resourced. So definitely places to look. And again, building relationships with them, doing all the things we talked about. Both of them have great listservs that you can sign up for, hold public meetings, that kind of thing. So yeah, I would definitely connect with them if you're building anything in that space. And then obviously California is very interesting, especially if you're working on interconnection stuff. It's big, like a big focus, and there's a ton of money. They passed a specific tax. I think the program is called EPIC, the electric rate payer or something or other. Anyways, they passed a specific tax, and California funnels millions and millions of dollars into innovation for the grid specifically. So, and yeah, they're literally right down the street from my office here. So if you want introductions, I work very closely with them. I'm happy to make a connection or introduction.
Should I stalk your office then, just to like have FaceTime, like you were
You
saying?
should that's literally one of the reasons we have an office here. And we do that regularly. We host people and then we walk down to the Energy Commission and hang out.
Amazing.
Go to meetings.
Okay.
So I would definitely recommend doing that. The last couple minutes, I do have a recommendation of a California-based consulting firm that can help navigate California funding. I do. Kevin, if you want to connect after, highly recommend a company that I've invested in as well, called Scout Climate. They leverage the OpenGrants API and some of our other tooling, and they've also hired 5 of our people, so they're dope.
Sedale, can you share a link or write that out in the chat?
Yeah. And if you reach out to them, just tell them I sent you.
I'll send you both an email, Kevin and Sedale, since Kevin, it looks like you're driving.
Perfect. That's great.
So adjacent to Devin's question, but on the municipal side, and maybe this isn't your remit, but my understanding is that most municipalities don't really, unless it's the big ones, don't really have the money or the budget to be giving out grants, but they oftentimes will want to work with folk, and partner with people in other ways. Do you have recommendations for that, other than as you previously said, just email folk and knock down doors?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I literally just did, and this was very self-serving of me, but my office is in the city of Folsom, and they have a very small staff who don't like have any kinds of resources to speak of. But you know, they have there's a fairly healthy tax base here, and they can attract federal and state money. And one of my friends just started working as their economic development director, and I was like, hey, I really want to be able to charge my car at work. I was like, you should install EV charging. And I was like, I will get you the grants from the state. The state will give you, as the community, money to put in public charging, and it's a good economic development driver. Here's all the research. And I just handed it all to her. And I was like, look, I am available for presentations, and I'll like, but you need to get me these grants so that we can put in EV charging so that I can charge my car at work for free. And she was like, sweet, this is exactly what I needed. If you can solve their problem, they can be the best, because the government will give them money. They're not going to give you money, probably, but they might. But like, as you know, if you can get them the resources they need, they're more than happy to do stuff. But municipalities in particular, like you said, they're not giving out grants. They're trying to get money, but they don't always know how, and they don't always have the staff. They tend to be under-resourced. And so if you can come to them with the whole thing figured out, ready to go, I'm super lucky. Like the community, the program is really well documented from the state, and the state gives these grants to the communities to put in public charging. And I was like, look, here's everything that you need. I'll fill out the grant for you. You just make sure it happens. And it's a win-win for everybody, right? We're going to get some new EV chargers. They're going to be paid for by the state. And the city gets to say, hey, we put in public charging, and we help reinvigorate our downtown. And now people are stopping and plugging in their cars. That's that's the synergy with your local municipality. Like, you want to do something with them, bring them the idea, find them the money, and get off to the races.
Amazing.
Cool, thank you.
You got a request to do this weekly, Sedale, so you better all do it again, open invite. But thank you again. If you guys want to connect with Sedale, he's obviously in Circle. You just check Circle Sedale. If he's not checking Circle, you can email me and I'll hunt him down for you. But thank you so much for doing this.
Awesome. It was my pleasure. Thank you all. Definitely hit me up, and I'll make sure to share info with Kevin.
Also, I love that the autocorrect for your name is sedate, because you're not sedated at all. But anyway, okay. Bye, everyone. See ya.
It's beautiful.